Good morning again, everybody. It's my pleasure to again introduce my another colleague, my friend, my mentor. I look up to him. He hasn't told, but I'm going to tell you one thing about John, which I know. And John mentioned that to me that he runs a marathon. So that's something I'm so inspired looking at him being so healthy, happy all the time, and the work he does is trauma informed. So he is contrast on both sides. So I'm very happy to introduce that he's currently the Director of Programs at the Salvation Army, Toronto Harbour Light and Homestead Addiction Services. Prior to this, he was the Executive Director of the Addiction Services for York Region. He has several years of clinical experience, both in a supervisory role and as a clinician in trauma work, substance abuse, and domestic violence. He also has a private practice where he works with men who have experienced childhood sexual abuse and works with men in the Canadian military. John holds a Master of Social Work degree from Laurentian University, Sudbury, and is a certified traumatologist and a certified compassion fatigue specialist through the Traumatology Institute of Toronto. John has experienced trauma-informed practices as well as developed and incorporated a compassion fatigue model of supervision in organization throughout the GTA and with his own organization as well. He also teaches in the School of Social Work at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. And John is a registered social worker in good standing with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John O'Mara.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. That was a lot. Wow. Thanks. I've decided to come down and kind of wander among people because that just seems really far away to me and kind of seems to be a barrier, and I kind of try to decrease barriers in my work. So I think what Amandeep, the important part of what Amandeep said for me just now is the two types of work that I do. I work in the substance abuse sector, in residential programs, community programs, supportive housing programs, transitional housing programs. I manage the day-to-day operations of all of those. My private practice, I work specifically with men who've experienced childhood sexual abuse. The difference is not only the nature of the population, the difference is the type of work that I do. In my organization in Toronto, we work from a trauma-informed perspective. In the work that I do with men who have childhood sexual abuse, I work in trauma-specific interventions. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between those two types of work. Both are critically important, but there's differences in the work that we do and what kind of work do each of you folks do with the work that you're doing with clients. I'd just like to get a sense of who's in the room. And I usually go around and ask people, but there's way too many people in this room to ask. Just raise your hand. Who are frontline workers? A lot. Administrators. Frontline workers. Frontline workers? Yeah. Administrators. A few, right? So any other folks that don't fall into those two categories? So I think it's important that everybody learns about trauma and what trauma is and the type of work that we do. I guess I'd like to get another sense of how experienced you guys are in working in trauma. Who would say that they know trauma quite a bit? How about a little bit? Okay. How about not too much? Okay, so most of you guys have some knowledge and experience in trauma. So the first thing I like to do is just to norm every room that I work in. We're going to be talking about high-level trauma today. not very specific cases, but sometimes people can be affected by the language and the work that we're doing in the room. So I usually just like to norm the room. This is Trauma Informed 101. Any room that I work with, I want to norm it. So here's some of the norming rules. Listen respectfully. Leave space for everyone's voice. Important. Agree to disagree. Lots of stuff might be said in the room today. You might agree with it, you might not. Value difference. Really important. We all bring something to the room. Suspend judgment. We're not judging each other today. We're hearing each other. Confidentiality. I'm not really sure we're going to get into personal things, but if anything comes up, respect confidentiality. Take care of yourself. Really important in this work. Take care of yourself. You need to get up, walk around, feel free. You need to go to the bathroom, go ahead. Have fun. As much as we possibly can today, have fun. Why do you think it's important that I just did that? What are your thoughts? Make people at ease? Yep. Other thoughts? Make people at ease, create safety, create space for conversations. In my organization, any meeting that we have, it's always normed. So that people have the ability to say what they need to say and be safe. So today, what do I want to talk about today? I want to talk a little bit about defining trauma and PTSD. I want to talk about who's experienced trauma. I want to talk about the connection between the trauma and brain. Not too much, a little. I want to talk about what trauma symptoms are. You guys that see these in the work that you do every day. I want to talk about a triphasic model of clinical trauma work. That's the model that I use in my trauma-specific clinical practice. And where you work in that model, because you do work in that model. So I want to talk, I usually start off about what the literature says about trauma, because I'm an academic too. I like to know what the literature says. So the literature talks about between 51 and 98% of public mental health clients diagnosed with severe mental illness have trauma histories. I believe it's closer to the 98, not the 51. Most people that we work with have trauma histories. There's a history of severe trauma, such as physical or sexual abuse, is correlated with various mental health problems. We're going to be talking about that when we talk about symptoms. People who experience trauma are also affected other ways. So some of the examples are really dissociative disorders, personality disorders, addictions, PTSD. Anybody here work with folks that might have some of those things? Yeah, of course. 76% of Canadian adults report some form of trauma exposure in their lifetime. 76%. It's a lot of people. I still believe that number is a little low. 1 in 10 people will suffer from PTSD. I think that number is absolutely way too low. We'll talk about that in a bit. And people in certain occupations are at higher risk, and many of us know this. First responders, firefighters, people in the military. In Canada, it's estimated up to 10% of war zone veterans, including war service veterans and peacekeeping forces, will go on to experience PTSD. So a lot of the work I do with the Canadian military is people that have been in combat. And women are twice as likely as men to be diagnosed with PTSD. The key is diagnosed, not experienced, diagnosed. 90% of women in treatment for alcohol problems at 5 Canadian treatment centers indicated abuse-related trauma as a child or adult, and 60% indicated other forms. We run women's residential programs. We know this to be absolutely true. Pretty near all of the women that come into our programs have a trauma history. In our men's treatment programs, I pulled some numbers. Without asking the men if they have trauma histories or childhood sexual abuse, they self-reported 26% of all the men in our residential programs over a 3-year period reported childhood sexual abuse without us asking. And 90% of females and 62% of male youths in co-occurring disorder treatment program at CAMH have traumatic stress. Refugees are at higher risk for PTSD as a result of the stressful events that forced them to flee their homeland and the difficulties in moving to another country and living with another country. I'm sure you folks know that a lot better than I do. So, here's the question, guys. Trauma and PTSD, same thing, different? What do you think? What are your thoughts? Pardon me? Different? How? Right. So it's post-trauma. Any other thoughts? Sure, yeah. So trauma could be the incident, the post-traumatic stress can be the behavioral things afterwards, yeah? Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, PTSD can be very long. Yeah. Whereas trauma could be a one-time event, very quick, yeah. Yes. Right, so PTSD is after the trauma, it's a result of, it's the consequence of. Any other thoughts? Oh, sorry, lots of... Sure, that's pretty significant. So trauma might be an incident, so I could be driving down the highway and an accident happens, I may not be able to avoid that. Whereas PTSD, it's not avoidable. But what we do is we try to survive the trauma at that point, right? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of the same thing, that trauma is the event, whereas PTSD is specific reaction to that event. Not everybody that experiences trauma will go.
Exactly. So if you have a trauma experience, doesn't mean that you're going to have PTSD. Great. See, I don't need to be here. You guys know all of this. So here's my definition, and there's lots of definitions of trauma. I've used this definition for a long, long time. So really, trauma for me is an event that overwhelms the individual's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved with that experience. When people are in trauma, they're totally overwhelmed. Sometimes they're unable to function in what we might think is in a reasonable or rational way. They're totally overwhelmed. So traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. I want to talk a little bit about that later. Sometimes what we think as easy solutions to things is if somebody is experiencing intense trauma, what they do may seem irrational to us, but it's normal to them. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So really just a couple of different types of trauma. You guys have already kind of talked about this a little bit. Type 1 and type 2 trauma. So type trauma is one event. It's it. Driving down the highway, get into a car accident, I witness a car accident, one-time event. Type 2 trauma, we were starting to refer to this as prolonged duress stress disorder, PTSD, and it can be an accumulation of events. So complex trauma can be many events, not just a single event. And it's really important to differentiate between that. So type 2 trauma is often historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, developmental trauma. Intergenerational, colonization, those types of things, the effect of colonization on First Nations community, developmental trauma, childhood sexual abuse, those types of things. That's complex trauma. Those events repeat over and over and over and over again. It's not witnessing an accident. PTSD. So I want to talk a little bit about PTSD because there's a very concrete definition to PTSD, right? So this is from the DSM-5. Folks familiar with the DSM-5? Yeah. So this is what psychiatrists will use to diagnose somebody having PTSD. The person goes through or sees something that involves actual death or serious injury. The person relives this event through dreams or recollections. Night terrors, nightmares. The person tries to avoid this. They will use all kinds of things as avoidance strategies to not relive the trauma. Let me just kind of go through it. Yeah, no, good question. So, yep. So the person often has difficulty sleeping and concentrating. Abuse actually does confirm to the definition, though. The person often has difficulty sleeping and concentrating. It has to last longer than a month, and it causes significant distress in daily life. That is the definition of trauma. In order to be identified or diagnosed as PTSD, this is what you need.
I thought there was an extension of that for people who had repetitively heard details
Yes.
of...
That's actually in number. So the psychiatrists have actually used point number 1 to what we call secondary trauma, right? Secondary trauma is not experiencing the trauma. It's being exposed, being constantly heard about the trauma, witnessing the trauma, seeing it on CNN, those types of
That's
things.
how our firefighters, our EMS are now being able to claim
Yes.
PTSD, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So the psychiatrists get that under point 1. So here's my problem. Does anybody else in the room have a problem with that definition, or is it just me?
Yeah, point 1 seems very strange to me because it says that it has to involve actual death or serious injury.
Yes.
Is that, sorry, because I remember that the skid from the old DSM, there were several things that fell under a traumatic event, not just seeing death or serious injury.
Right, right. So
don't
this
know
is
why
the new
that is.
definition, right?
Okay.
Anybody else have any concerns with that definition? We are no, okay, go ahead. Yeah, yeah. The biggest concern that we have, my partner in private practice and I, the concern that we have is in order to meet criteria, you have to see a psychiatrist to get that diagnosis. We know lots of people that probably meet criteria of PTSD but don't have access to a psychiatrist. So for me, that's an equity position, right? Some people might get services, other people might not get services, because in order to get many services in Ontario, you need to have a diagnosis. If you don't have access to a psychiatrist, how do you get a diagnosis? You can't, because a medical doctor is the only person that can diagnose you. That's the concern that we have. So, you guys work with a lot of people. Who experience post-traumatic stress? Anybody you work with? Pardon?
Almost all.
Almost all? Yeah, so what's the populations that you might work with?
Well, refugees, newcomers, women and youth.
Children? Other people? What populations? Pardon me? Seniors? Yeah.
Domestic violence,
Domestic violence?
stateless,
Stateless people? Yes. Other folks? What other populations that you work with might experience post-traumatic stress?
The LGBTQ community.
Yes. Absolutely. Marginalization. First Nations, Indigenous. Yeah. There's the answer. Anybody can experience it, right? We'll get to that. I just want to kind of go through some of the stuff. Who has experienced PTS or complex trauma? Those living on the edge. The homeless population. People who have high substance use dependence. As I said earlier, everybody that we work with has post-traumatic stress. Folks with a diagnosed mental illness or an undiagnosed mental illness have a trauma history, generally post-traumatic stress. People who are oppressed, victims of violence, or experience stigma have post-traumatic stress. So some examples are women and children in violent relationships, people who've experienced sexual abuse, childhood, adult sexual abuse, and people who have or are experiencing racism. People who have been affected by colonization, intergenerational trauma. So when I talk about colonization, in the Canadian context, we often talk about First Nations, Indigenous people, have post-traumatic stress, and it's intergenerational post-traumatic stress. Colonization just didn't happen in Canada. Colonization happened anywhere Europeans populated the world and put in policies of assimilation and racism. So colonization happened in Central America, South America, Asia, South Asia, Australia, India, the Mideast. Wherever Europeans traveled to get wealth, they imposed rules of power in order to get what they wanted. And still happening, absolutely. So I just like to say that because often when we talk about colonization, we put it in the Canadian context. It's not. It happened in Hawaii. I have a friend of mine that goes to Hawaii every year, First Nations woman, and she meets up with people from all over the world to talk about intergenerational trauma as a result of colonization. School violence. People who have experienced school violence. So we're hearing a lot of that in the news today. It can be bullying, it can be internet violence, it can be all kinds of things happening in the school. And other acts of violence. So people that have experienced a robbery, an assault, those types of things. Family or friends of people who've had trauma narratives, maybe going through their own PTS. People who have been in war. As I said before, I work with our troops, but it's also important that troops on the other side may have PTS. Anybody in the war zone that's not a combatant certainly has post-traumatic stress. Civilians, child soldiers. Folks work with child soldiers? Anybody? Who said yeah? Yeah. Yeah, that's difficult work. And people who have experienced catastrophic events such as natural disasters and accidents probably have post-traumatic stress. Who's experienced trauma? And your answer, I can't remember who said it. Everybody in this room has experienced trauma. That's really important to understand and to remember. For me, in the work that I do, it's really to understand my own trauma narrative and how that may impact the work that I do, how I might be triggered.
And financial and cultural abuse that people face as well?
Sure.
I know you know that, but because it's never given as much as value, for lack of a better word, value as physical or sexual abuse.
Absolutely.
In terms of the aftermath.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a sec, but thank you. No, yeah. Trauma has a huge impact on people. The difference is, although we might all have a trauma narrative, maybe not all of us have PTS, have experienced post-traumatic stress. That's the difference.
Sorry, I have a question.
Oh, I'm just.
No, I just didn't understand.
Oh, really what I was, so she's asking, she didn't understand the definition when I said we're starting to call it post-traumatic stress rather than post-traumatic stress disorder. The reason is because in order to have they're the same. The reason to have, the only way to get PTSD is to be diagnosed by a psychiatrist. And we know that lots of other people have the same symptoms, but don't have the diagnosis. And because you don't have the diagnosis, you may not be eligible for some services. Sorry.
Sorry, I just want to understand. You said except combatants, they
Pardon?
would. You said a while ago, earlier, that except combatants, they wouldn't go through trauma.
No, I said the opposite, actually. I said that civilians and people in a war zone will actually go through post-traumatic stress.
Including combatants as well.
Yeah, combatants on both sides. That's really
Yeah.
important, because often we'll pick a side
Yeah.
and really kind of provide services to people on our side. But other people that may, perhaps, for example, may have come to Canada
Yep.
that have gone through, that have been in the military, they've also experienced post-traumatic stress, as well as anybody in the war zone, families, anybody that's affected by the war.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah, please, any questions, just clarify. So we all have trauma, yep.
Can someone who comes to another, like newcomers, have also trauma?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, people that come to a new country, I actually think, yes, I think that's a huge traumatization, right? People have to kind of figure out whether it's post-traumatic stress or simple trauma, not complex trauma, but absolutely. Yeah. So we all have a trauma narrative, but we all haven't experienced post-traumatic stress. So I remember 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the death of my mom and my father, went through a grieving process. It was very traumatic, loss of my life, had to go through my own process. I got some support. I wasn't experiencing post-traumatic stress at that time, though. I was going through a grieving process. So some of the ways that trauma manifests itself, shows itself, some of the things people do, in other words, to deal with trauma. And I call it a trauma place. It's my trauma place. That's how I call it. So some of the ways that people may deal with it or may show is substance use, including smoking. Smoking is substance abuse. People may experience depression and anxiety, overwhelming depression, high anxiety. I talked with a gentleman yesterday diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. We were talking about some things, and you just see the anxiety coming out, right? Related to trauma. Anger. Anger is a trauma symptom. I work with men. We call it an anger management group. So people have heard of that language, right? I hate it. But we have to call it that because that's what people recognize. When the men come in, it shifts really quickly to anger is a trauma symptom. And we kind of frame it in those terms. Eating and sleeping disorders, phobias, panic disorders, suicide, self-harm, psychosomatic disorders, and physical inactivity, just shutting down. So there's some of the ways that you might understand if somebody is experiencing trauma or has post-traumatic stress and is going to their trauma place. I want to talk about the brain. I don't want to talk about the brain too much, but it's really important to understand how the brain deals or tries to cope with somebody that has experienced trauma. Think about it. This is the population that I work with. Think about it. 3-year-old young boy experienced childhood sexual abuse from a trusted family member. How do you think that 3-year-old deals with that? Compartmentalizes, yeah? Yeah.
Tantrums.
Pardon me?
Tantrums.
Yes. So all the symptoms will come out, absolutely. So they're the symptoms that come out. The way the child deals with that is the brain reshapes itself into survival mode and allows them to cope with that each day. The brain changes. So often the people that I work with may be in a 20-year-old body, but the way their brain is functioning is the functioning of a 3 or a 4-year-old. They're totally in survival mode all the time. They're in protection mode. Childhood sexual abuse is power and control.
Quiet, is that?
Quiet is a symptom.
Is it the case that the child should show some symptoms if he is abused?
Quiet is a symptom. Yeah. So just the brain, just really, I want to go through this very, very quickly. The neurobiology of the brain. So the brain is, there's a two-part brain. There's the automatic part, which is the nervous system, and the thinking part. So when faced with threat or danger, the mind and body prepare us for fight or flight through the automatic nervous system. So folks are familiar with this, I'm thinking, right? This isn't news to people. Fight or flight mechanism. The automatic nervous system keeps on going whether we think about it or not. When we're being triggered and reacting to something, we're still breathing, right? The automatic nervous system has two divisions that work together. So the first one is the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight, sympathetic. And the parasympathetic, and it takes care of the body's needs when not in fight or flight. So the parasympathetic are very automatic things. Breathing, heartbeat, those types of things. So there's a constant stream of messages going to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus returns message. So there's a little communication pattern going on in there. So this is just really a diagram of it. We also have 3 brains. I never knew that. Sometimes I need more than 3. So the reptilian brain, so everybody has a reptilian brain. Animals have reptilian brains. Dogs have reptilian brains. We have reptilian brains. These are the brains that go back centuries, protect us. The limbic system, folks know what the limbic system is in the brain? That's the feeling part of our brain. We feel through the limbic system. And the neocortex is the thinking part of our brain. So I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes in the context of when somebody gets triggered. So the brain areas that are implicated in a stress response, so when we're all under stress, there's parts of our brain that jump into gear. The first one is the amygdala and the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala, folks know what the amygdala does? Just curious. So the amygdala is important in our brain. It stores memory. That's the first thing it does. And the second thing it does is it deals with emotional regulation. When you're trying to teach somebody a timeout, for example, this is the part of the brain that you're trying to deal with, the amygdala. Stores memory, emotional regulation. So again, the amygdala is emotional content. It identifies if there's danger, if there's no danger. It identifies whether I have memories in the past that I've experienced that might ignite me. That's what the amygdala does. I'm just going to kind of zip by this stuff. Whoops. I broke it. I got it back. I just want to talk a little bit about triggers in the brain, right? So we all understand triggers. That's language that we use all of the time, right? So what's a trigger? What's a trigger? Yeah. Right. Something that ignites us. Something that sets us off. That's what a trigger is, right? So triggers, from my perspective anyway, or from the literature, it talks about triggers are activated by sensory stuff, right? So we can smell something, we can hear something, we can see something, we can feel something, or we can taste something, right? Those senses goes to the amygdala. The amygdala makes a decision. Good trigger, bad trigger. And how do I respond to that? So here's an example. I was in downtown Toronto one day, and I'm walking by a store, and it's a bread store. And I smell baked bread, right? I'm going, wow. That takes me back to a time when my grandmother used to bake bread on a Sunday morning. And we used to go in, eat, there'd be family and stuff there, we'd have a good time. Really pleasant memory. What's happened there is the sense of smell ignited the amygdala, and the amygdala took me back to a pleasant memory, and I went into the limbic part of my brain. I could feel it, happiness, contentness, and the brain could think about it. That's called a positive trigger. There's negative triggers. Negative triggers. So this is a common example, but I've actually worked with people where this happens. I was working with a gentleman about 1.5 years ago who had just returned back from, it was a couple of years ago, he had just returned back from his tour. And he was walking down the street. And he heard the backfire of a car, literally. And he went into combat mode. This person was experiencing post-traumatic stress. When he heard the backfire, the sensory was the hearing, it went into his amygdala. His amygdala brought up fight or flight. His amygdala brought up danger, danger, danger. And his body reacted that way. The amygdala did not have the ability to discern the whole feelings that he experienced was fear. And I need to protect myself. That's called amygdala override. So the amygdala doesn't have the ability to divide between good and bad. It goes into protect mode. Most people that have experienced post-traumatic stress, that's what's happening for them in the moment when they get triggered. Make sense? Post-traumatic stress is not normal stress. It's high-level survival skills that we use when we're triggered to post-traumatic stress. It's just something important to remember, I think. So when we talk about trauma in the brain, really it's just what I talked about before. The brain adapts to the trauma in order to create survival. Otherwise, people can't survive overwhelming trauma. The brain needs to adapt. When the brain adapts, so that man that I talked about who went into his place of fear and went into action, went into a trauma response. He did not have the ability to think cognitively at that point. He was on amygdala override. Everything's going into the feeling part of his brain, and he's responding. So it's a trauma response. So people have trauma responses if they live in conditions of constant danger, fear, stress that results in a state of constant alertness or hyperarousal. People who have PTS are always in hyperarousal. Whether it appears so or not, they're always on guard. Survival mode. The amygdala loses its ability to discriminate, and the brain begins to have persistent, reoccurring, overly defensive reactions to even harmless stimuli. That is so important. Sometimes we ask people that we work with to do things that they're fundamentally incapable of doing. Take a time out. I can't tell you how many times I've asked somebody to do that, and they're fundamentally can't do it because they're in survival mode. So really a lot of the strategies become, how do you take care of yourself? How do you keep yourself safe when you're going to your trauma place? When you're going into amygdala override, when you're going into self-protective, when you're using survival skills. Harmless. We think that they're harmless stimuli. For us, they are. For people who experience post-traumatic stress, they're life-threatening. Another important point when I work with people who experience trauma have symptoms. They don't have memories. Somebody that's experienced intergenerational trauma, somebody experienced historical trauma over time. You don't have memories, you have symptoms. And all of the people that we're working with, we recognize the symptoms. And when you're becoming trauma-informed, one of the things we ask people to do is to not judge people on their symptoms. Because if they have post-traumatic stress, they're going into survival mode. Our organization does a lot of work in how do we identify clients' behaviors and how do we, as service providers, shift the language that we use. Right? In our business, clients are often called non-compliant. Clients are often called not treatment ready. Clients are often called bad actors. Clients are often called troublemakers. We have all of this language that we put on people that are actually using survivor skills. That's the thing that got them through the trauma. And so when they come to us, we want to shift them. Addicts. We use that one a lot. Not in our organization. Addictions people, addicts. They're addicts. Such a stigmatizing word. Addicts. So virtually all symptoms have helped the individual survive the trauma. Important. The first task of becoming a trauma-informed organization is actually to take a look and see how we view people, how we label people, how we name people, how we judge people, how we re-traumatize people. That's the first job. So, trauma symptoms. What are some of the symptoms that you guys see in the folks that you work with? Pardon? Silence, yeah. Pardon? Overreaction? Panic attacks, yeah. Agitation? Insomnia, not able to sleep? Confrontational, oh yeah. Deny.
Avoidance.
Avoidance is a big one. Confrontational, I never get confrontational. I don't know anybody in this room. Sometimes they can be a very normal, healthy behavior. Depression? Emotional? What kind? Crying, yeah. Pardon me? Sensitive, yes.
Aggressive behavior.
Aggression? Pardon me? Refraining from certain actions. Can you give me an example? Right. Right. So it's something that you might be very, very skilled at, you could no longer do because that was the traumatic event for you. Yes. Like school teachers, I mean, I've heard some of the school teachers that think that was happening in Florida, they can't go back in and teach anymore, right, because of the trauma. You know?
Sometimes they feel sick and no energy to do anything.
Yes, no energy, illnesses. Other thoughts? Hard sleeping, yeah.
I have an example, but I'm not sure if it's a sort of trauma or no. A lady, I was working with her, and she was referred to an English school where she has to keep her child with the childminder, and she refused. She said, they will kidnap my child. I don't trust anyone to keep my child with. I don't know if it's trauma or no, but that's unusual for me. She doesn't trust anyone.
Yeah, it would be my guess that there's some trauma there, but that, yeah. Yes, low self-esteem, shame, yeah. So I've got some of them. You guys know them all. For us, it's really to identify them in 5 different areas. So we've compartmentalized a lot of the symptoms that you guys talked about, and we put them in 5 different areas. So the first one is physical, cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual. The reason we've kind of classified them in 5 different areas is when you're doing trauma-specific work, and even when you're doing trauma-informed work, there's certain strategies that you use and certain strategies that you might not use, depending on the symptoms. So sometimes we actually give people things to do that we think is helpful for them that may re-traumatize. In the world I work in, we often ask people to journal. Might be good, might be a re-traumatization technique too. Asking somebody to write their trauma narrative without having the ability to take care of themselves. Right? So that's why we kind of categorize them. So the physical responses, eating disturbances, sleep disturbances, pain, low energy, chronic unexplained pain, headaches, anxiety, and panic attacks. You guys have talked a lot about them. Oh, I keep breaking it. Emotional. Emotional is a big one. There's lots of emotional ones, right? Depression, spontaneous crying, hopelessness, anxiety, fear, vulnerability, panic attacks, feeling out of control. Remember, when people have been traumatized, it's a feeling of not being in control. Irritability, anger, resentment, numbness, shutting down. Frightening thoughts, difficulties in relationships. Guilt, shame, self-blame, feeling damaged or like a bad person. Cognitively. Memory lapses, especially about the trauma. Don't want to think about it. Yeah. Loss of time. Being flooded and overwhelmed with recollections of the trauma. Right? So you can actually feel overwhelmed just by recalling the trauma. Thinking about it. Difficulty making decisions, choices. Can't concentrate. Distracted. Foggy. Call it fusion. Foggy. Suicide ideation. Generalizing a whole people or culture as bad. You hear a lot of this, especially in war zones. Spiritual. Questioning the presence of a God. Looking for a God. Looking for a higher power. Looking for a protector. Questioning purpose in life. Why am I here? Thoughts of being evil. Turning away from faith or obsessively going to faith. Either one. A loss of self or being connected. And the big one for me around spirituality, the loss of hope. the overwhelming feeling of hopelessness. Right? No purpose. Spiritual. We often don't look at the spiritual symptoms. We see the other ones. But really, purpose in life is important. So, where do we all fit in when we're working with people that have experienced trauma, that are survivors? This is the triphasic model. This is a model that I use in my clinical work with people. And triphasic because there's 3 phases. First phase of the triphasic model is safety and stabilization. When I'm working with somebody, I need to be able to give them the skills to help them manage their trauma symptoms. That's all it is. When I work with clients for childhood sexual abuse, and this transfers to all types of post-traumatic stress, not just childhood sexual abuse, I can spend years in stage 1. I'm talking years. Imagine somebody comes to you that has a history of post-traumatic stress, and the way that they deal with that is by taking substances, self-harm, and cutting. Suicide ideation. You think that's 5 sessions? Years. Years, years. The second stage is remembrance and mourning, or the trauma narrative. The person actually talks about their experiences in their trauma narrative. After I've gone through stage 1, stage 2 is quick. Literally can be anywhere from a month to 3 months. You can use a trauma narrative, you can use multiple trauma narratives. The point at this stage is really to witness the narrative. So, I have lots of people that I work with, including my own staff. They come to me. The client wants to talk about the trauma. The client wants to talk about the trauma. The client wants to talk about the trauma. What do we do? That is a trauma symptom. The client, for some reason, thinks that by talking about it, that's the most helpful thing that they can do. That's a trauma symptom, much like anxiety. They need to talk about it. The challenge is, what do we, as frontline workers and clinicians, do about it? We'll talk about that in a second. The third phase is reintegration, reconnection. This is a lifelong process for the client. In addictions, we call it recovery work. It's reintegrating to make life meaningful. They can manage their trauma symptoms when they're triggered, and they have a life of their choosing. That really details a lot of stuff. When I work with people going through third stage, they're evaluating family relationships. They're evaluating friendships. They're evaluating toxic environments. And what are they going to do about it? Totally their choice, but they're the types of things that we're looking at. You got to remember, people, especially historical intergenerational childhood trauma, have no role models, have no structure. It's all about survival. Relationships are generally toxic. Reintegration is looking at all of those types of things that have affected their life. So I'm going to kind of go through it. So this is first stage stuff. Safety and stabilization. The only task here is to have safety for the client, no other task. You're not fixing the client, you're not talking about their history, you're trying to make them safe. Social work 101, do no harm. That's what you're doing. Victims of chronic trauma are betrayed by their experiences as well as their body. The things that they've experienced have had an effect on them, and their body has reacted to those experiences as a way of surviving. It's all about survival. Symptoms become source of triggers resulting in re-traumatization. When I see a client experiencing a symptom, when I saw that man yesterday with general anxiety disorder, the first thing that I knew was he was in a trauma place right now. He was becoming re-traumatized. He was experiencing a trauma symptom. My goal at that time was to bring it down. Help them symptom manage. Teach them how to symptom manage. The clinicians, the social workers, the counselors' primary goals during safety and stabilization are to help the person gain internal and external control. Internal symptom management, external control of their environment, and enable the person to make a gradual shift from unpredictable danger to reliable safety. I'll talk about that in a minute. Remember, when you're seeing trauma symptoms, they're going to their trauma place, they're overwhelmed. All they're trying to do is survive that moment. What looks like to you as unhealthy, not good, is very normal to them. What we're trying to do is to stabilize them, to ground them. So really, the remembrance and mourning, person reconstructs the trauma story in minute detail. So when I do start getting into the trauma narrative, I'm going into minute detail. What I know before I go there is that the client, the person that I'm working with, has the ability to take care of himself when he becomes re-traumatized, because he will. That's what I know. And I don't go there until I know that that person has the ability to take care of himself or herself. So when I hear the stories, it's usually bits and pieces. And the goals are to create a safe space for the person to relive and to begin to make sense of the experiences. Put it into context. And this part of the trauma work is putting things into context. When this happened to you as a child, this is what it was about. It was about power and control. This is what happened, how you survived that. It's putting it into context for people. It's assigning blame. But mostly what I do is I bear witness. At this point in time, I have the confidence that the client has the ability to ground himself when he becomes re-traumatized, so he's not going to be leaving my office, going home having night terrors, right? But it's actually to bear witness, to normalize things, to encourage. So there's just some techniques that we'll use. I'm just going to kind of skip by them. Reconnecting, I've talked a little bit about this before. Reconnecting is really redefining oneself in the context of meaningful relationships. So clients will examine every relationship that they have in the moment. Is that supportive? Is that harmful? Is it toxic? Closure on past events and belief in a higher power. Like gain that sense of hope and purpose in life. Most trauma survivors feel a sense of shame, guilt, and being used. How do you find purpose? You understand why this might be a long process. And just what I talked about before, just the timing of the intervention is important. And techniques are stage appropriate. So that's what I said, when you recognize symptoms, you have to be using strategies that actually help the person with the symptoms. Trauma-informed versus trauma-specific. I believe that every organization, every hospital, every medical facility, every Walmart needs to be trauma-informed. I believe that. So trauma-informed organizations adhere to trauma principles that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. They acknowledge safety, trustworthiness, choice and control. So these are the principles. And it's stage one work in the triphasic models. Trauma-specific organizations, on the other hand, they also adhere to the trauma principles. They work in all three stages of the triphasic models. Trauma-informed organizations work in stage one. So my organization's downtown, all they do, work in stage one. They do not go into the trauma narrative. We're an addiction organization. Believe me, people want to tell their stories. They do not go into trauma narrative, until they don't go into trauma narrative, and they don't go into the third stage. They work in stage 1 only. Symptom identification, containment of symptoms, helping people manage the symptoms. That's the work they do. Anything else will create re-traumatization if the client isn't ready. Kind of makes sense for folks? People have difficulties with these concepts sometimes. Right, no, it's fair enough. So like the staff in our organization identify symptoms, so clients come with symptoms. Some of those symptoms that we talked about before: anger, anxiety, depression, loss of hope, those types of things. They identify those symptoms, they help the people understand those symptoms, and then they help the people deal with those symptoms, cope with those symptoms. So, if you're getting angry right now, what is it that you need to do? Like, how do you teach a person to regulate? That's all you do. You don't ask them about the narrative. You don't. You will re-traumatize. Absolutely. So trauma-specific organizations work in all 3 stages, and clinicians need to be highly skilled, highly trained to work in this area. Who would you like to have your heart surgery done by? Your family doctor or the heart specialist? How about your cancer operation or your brain surgery? Family doctor or the specialist? Same thing. What I always say to people is, if you open the can of worms, the trauma can of worms, you better be able to deal with what comes out. Otherwise, you're not doing your client any service. Right? So, I want to talk about competency. Anybody here a social worker? I'm a social worker. Yeah, one. Yeah, lots of social workers. You belong to the college? So, if you call yourself a social worker, you belong to the college, right? That's kind of like the deal, right? Our college talks about competency. What does our college say about competency? Social workers. What does it say? Do not work out of your scope of practice. Do not work out of your area of competency. If you do, you're in violation of the code of ethics and the standards of practice, and you can be reported to the college and your license could be suspended. You need to be competent. So competency is really possession of required skill, knowledge, and qualification. It's a principle of professional practice, identifying the ability of the provider to administer safe and reliable care on a consistent basis. I consider myself highly competent in trauma. I consider myself highly competent in substance abuse because I have the training and I have the skills to do that work. Somebody comes into my office with an acquired brain injury. It's like, oh my goodness, I get it. ABI is part of substance abuse. I don't feel competent to work in that area, and I will help the person find somebody that can helpful, because I might be doing a bunch of things that are counterproductive and not helpful, even though I think they are. We have to work within our competency, and our competency is about professional training. I'm not going to go into this too much. The college of social workers, I just actually talked about it. We all have to be competent. And if we're not, we could be reported to the board. They will come in, they will do an investigation, and if they deem us incompetent, they will suspend us. Right? You social workers, that's what happens, yeah?
I wanted to go back to the informed versus specific. Can everyone?
Informed versus specific.
Okay. I just have a specific question about something that's happened with me a few times. So I am not a clinician, so I would need to stay in stage 1. But what happens when a client starts to talk about their trauma in detail to you, and it's the first time they're revealing it in your office, and you don't want to go into stage 2 with them because obviously you can't, but you don't want to tell them to stop talking because it's a very important time to build rapport, and then you don't want them to be re-traumatized, and you just want to stabilize them, but they keep talking. What do I do?
Run. No. Anybody else been in that position? Yeah, everybody, right? Including myself, of course. Clients want to come in. They see you as the all-competent, expert, wise person who's going to fix me because I'm going through all of this stuff. They're there to get help. And all of a sudden they're telling you something. It's kind of like, oh my goodness. What do you do? What I do is, and what most clinicians do, especially trauma, because when they come into our services, when they're coming in to see me for childhood sexual abuse, they know what they're coming for and I know what they're coming for. Doesn't mean I talk about the narrative right away. They want to. What I do in that moment, and what I do in our other practice, and our clinicians do, when the client comes in and they're presenting and they want to go to their trauma narrative, you use a breaking technique. And there's many breaking techniques. The one that we often use is in the moment breaking techniques. I'm hearing you want to talk about your story. I'm hearing that. You're acknowledging it. You're validating it. I understand. I get it. You want to tell. I'm not really sure this is the right time to tell it because of that. You might talk about that right now around safety, or you might hold on to that. Because if I see symptoms in the moment, what I kind of go to, as you tell me you want to talk about your story, these are the kind of things I'm noticing. Can you tell me what you're experiencing right now? You go right into symptom identification. Because it'll come out when they want to tell the story, because they'll be in re-traumatization mode at that point. Or they are before they come into your office. And there's many symptoms. If the person experiences anxiety, he goes, well, I'm really anxious. I feel really crappy right now. Let's talk about that. And you're not talking about what's causing the crappiness. What you're talking about is helping him identify that he's going to his trauma place, and what are the skills and strategies that I can help him work with in the moment to de-escalate. And then after it's all done, an hour and a half later, you let him in on the secret. When you first came in, this is what I saw happening. This is what we did. This is what I went to. My guess is that you're experiencing high trauma or high anxiety most of the time. Here's some of the strategies that you might be able to use to help bring yourself down. Symptom containment. It's not the time to get into the trauma story, and it's not the time to explain what you're doing. Next session, maybe. That happens first session a lot. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense? It's always in the here and now, symptom management, symptom containment. How do I help you get through this moment right now? What do I do? Having him tell the story ain't helping. Getting worse. How can I help you right now, in the moment, right now? Boom. How do we keep you safe when you leave here? Because it'll resurface again. What's your plan? That's the strategies that you use. Yeah. You have to jump in right away. And a lot of people jump the other way because they actually don't know what to do in the moment. It can be overwhelming for the clinician, right? So college members don't misrepresent professional qualifications. So, now that I talk, you never go to the trauma place, sometimes you do. And here's where you do. Not everybody that we work with has post-traumatic stress. Some people have type 1 trauma, right? So what we need to do is we kind of do an assessment. Am I working with somebody in front of me that has type 1 trauma or complex trauma? So the person sitting in front of me says, going through a rough time right now. Me and my partner aren't getting along so well. We're thinking of separating. Okay? Do a little talking with the person. It's not post-traumatic stress. It's relationship stuff. Right? I might want to kind of go, oh, tell me what happened. Right? What's happening for you right now? So you still do a lot of the same stuff, other than you can collect information and go into the narrative. What happened? My goodness. You must be going through a lot right now. Tell me, how are you dealing with that? How are you coping with that, right? These are the questions that you're asked. You're kind of going where the client is in the moment, what they need. Fine, that's good. So at that time, you'll actually talk about the narrative, you'll identify the symptoms, and you'll help the person with self-care strategies. If somebody would meet the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress, the only thing you do in that point is go into safety stabilization, symptom identification, symptom management. So here's the news. Most of the people that we work with do not want to go into stage 2 trauma. Most of the people that I work with, or many of the people that we work with, all they want to do is to be able to manage day-to-day stuff like every other person in the world does. They just want to help to identify symptoms and to do symptom management. That's it. The literature talks to 65 to 70% of people just wanting to be able to manage symptoms. Every time I get triggered, I don't want to go out and get myself into trouble. What we find is clinicians are eager to go there. They want to hear the story because they think that that serves some purpose. And all we're doing is setting the client up for re-traumatization. You have to be really careful who's directing the conversation here and why you're doing it. Really important. It's generally us. Don't open the can of worms unless you're kind of ready to deal with what comes out the other end. Oops. Whoops, I broke it. I really did this time. Oh. So really, I just want to talk about, the other thing I want to go is like the most important work that you guys can do and the work that you do is help people identify symptoms, give them grounding skills, keep them safe. That's the most important work that you can do. The people that you work with probably haven't felt safe for a long, long time. Right? You normalize things. So I'm just going to zip through this quickly because I'm not really sure what time it is. Well, real quick. 15 minutes? Okay. So really, I'm going to go through real quick. So what is safety? How do we define safety? How do we know people are safe? So it's really resolving the environment causing the physical danger. That's the first thing. Are the people still in their danger zone? Are they in the war zone? Are they in the home where there's domestic violence? If they choose to stay in the home where there's domestic violence, do they have safety plans? Have we educated them around the consequences? Right? Self-destructive thoughts and behavior. They don't have these self-destructive thoughts and the behaviors, even though they may last for a while, they become less and less intense, right? So suicidal, homicidal ideation is addressed. Eating disorders is addressed. Alter ego states. Anybody here work with multiple personalities? Common trauma symptoms. I worked with one person, 15 personalities that I met. There may be more. Addictions, complex addictions. I get that people want to work in harm reduction. I'm all for it. I worked at Addiction Services, community-based organization, harm reduction agency, but there's place for people with high severity addictions. Right? You need to assess the addiction severity. Trauma bonding. People know what that is? So people that have had high-level post-traumatic stress will go into this thing we call trauma bonding. We'll start making pacts with other people that have experienced trauma. We'll decide to put ourselves at risk. This happened in Appawatustack. Remember that a few years ago, where all of the youth up there were doing suicide. Those trauma bonding activities, intergenerational trauma bonding activities. Media doesn't frame it in that. Media sensationalized. Risk-taking behaviors and isolation. Let me get through this quick. And really restructuring the victim mythology into survivor identity. And then the one after that is the thriving identity. So really, before you get into stage 2 work, you have to do a couple of things. Resolving impending environment and physical danger, and a sense of ability to feel safe, am safe. Am safe, feel safe. I'm going to give you an example of this. Am safe, feel safe. My clinicians use this all of the time. Because people that are actually have post-traumatic stress never feel safe. Even when they are safe, they don't feel safe. So the plan is to kind of go, yes, I understand that you're feeling unsafe, but is that actually true? So there's a lot of techniques around, where are you right now? You're in my office, this is an unsafe place for you, those kind of things, right? But they're always feeling unsafe and overwhelmed. So here's the story. I was listening to CBC radio a couple of years ago, and they were talking about the fires out in Alberta. What's the name of that community? Fort McMurray. They're talking about the fires out there, right? And they're interviewing this first responder. And they're asking the first responder, fireman, asking him, you know, what's it like for you? And he says, it's tough. And she asked him, and interviewers, hope there's no interviewers in here, but they re-traumatize people all the time. But anyway, that's another issue. So she's asking him, she did a really good job, she's asking him, right, about his experience, and he said, it's tough. He says, what's tough about it? He says, the people. And she said, could you explain that? And he said, about 10 years ago in my community, we experienced the same thing. He came from Slave Lake. And what happened in Slave Lake was devastating fires over several days. The whole town was burned down. It was a mirror of what happened in Fort McMurray. And then the interviewer said, so what's difficult about that? He says, well, I bring those things here with me. But he said, he talked about a story where he was in Slave Lake just before he came to Fort McMurray, and there was a fire. And he's responding to the fire, and there was a woman on the corner, and she was trembling. She had high anxiety. And he went to the woman and he said, what's happening? And the woman said, this is going to happen again. The house is burning. The whole town is going to be burnt. We're going to go through what we went through 10 years ago. She went to her trauma place. She was triggered in the moment. Amygdala override to her trauma place. The firefighter said to her, yes, I know that happened. And I know that this can be a scary time for you, but it's okay. We've got this under control. We've learned from this. We're going to get this fire. It's not going to spread. We're going to shut it down. All of her anxiety was relieved. Am safe, feel safe. She was triggered in the moment. He identified that, and he said, it's going to be okay. That's all she needed. She didn't need therapy. She needed to feel okay. Am safe, feel safe. The guys downtown use this all the time. They find this really helpful. So I'm not really going to, so again, trauma survivors are always in a state of arousal and always feeling in danger. I'm not going to go into this. I just want to go through these trauma-informed practices and principles real quick. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. So within our organization, we follow these principles. We have the conversations about these principles at every staff meeting that we have, every team meeting that we have. One of these principles are talked about. So they are acknowledgement. So acknowledgement is really just acknowledging that everybody that walks into our door, everybody that accesses our services, and us, have a trauma experience. Everybody. Acknowledge it. It's not an apparition. It's not an exception. It's the norm. It's not only clients, it's us too. And I will get triggered by clients, believe me. I need to know that. Sure, nobody in here gets triggered by clients, right? Nobody reacts. We're all good. Safety. Everybody in the building needs to feel safe. Clients, staff, visitors, everybody that uses our services. The only reason for discharge from our residential programs are safety issues. Not problem issues, behavioral issues, safety issues. Trustworthiness. We need to develop that relationship with all of the people that we work with to develop trust. Remember, people are overwhelmed. Trauma survivors do not trust. We'll term them manipulative, those kind of things, right? We need to kind of just be there, be present, let them come, right? Choice and control. We give them choice and control over lots of things. Now, we have rules in our treatment program. They don't get to decide when they're going to go to groups and things like that, but we offer them as much choice and control over their treatment planning and what they need to do while they're in treatment as we possibly can. Remember, trauma is about power and control. Relational and collaborative approaches. How do we develop treatment plans with the client, and the client as part of developing his or her own treatment plan and having the ability to comment on it? Right? I'm not sure with folks in here, but we offer people the ability to look at the case notes. They get to comment on their case notes and put in writing what they think. And strengths-based. Always identifying client strengths. People that are survivors have incredible strengths and abilities. I love working with drug dealers. I do. They have such great business sense. They know marketing techniques. They know how to market their product. They know how to get customers. They know all kinds of stuff. Build on their strengths, right? So really, my final thought, when I ask anybody, when I suggest anybody might work from a trauma-informed perspective rather than a trauma non-informed perspective, always come from a place of curiosity. I'm always wanting to know what happened to this person rather than label the person. I'm always curious. Right? So rather than thinking, what's wrong with this person, what happened? What were the incredible things that you went to that you needed to survive from, and how did you survive those things? Coming from a place of curiosity is the first step to becoming trauma-informed. And that's it. I don't know whether we have time for questions. I think we went through a lot of questions and stuff, but it's up to you guys. Please.
I just want to ask a question about intergenerational trauma. Like
Sure.
How far back does that go? And how impactful it is, or how do you distinguish between a past life intergenerational trauma and maybe a recent incident? Someone could just have come from a war-torn zone, and maybe 3 generations back, their
Yes.
family may have had a massacre in the village in which they live.
Yes.
How do you distinguish which trauma is which?
Right.
If there is a difference, and does past life hypnotic regression works? Is that
Yeah.
an effective technique used in trying to
Yeah,
unwrap?
so I'll answer the first one. Like, the intergenerational trauma are actually survival skill passed on from person to person, right? Because of the effects of power and abuse and those types of things. In Canada, the context that we put in Canada is First Nations intergenerational trauma. I have a friend of mine, I lived in Northern Ontario, and a friend of mine, and I'm not going to say her name, but she lives on Mississauga First Nations. And she said, you know, as an adult, she remembers her mom in the 60s saying, run and hide in the bush, because the government people are going to come and they're going to pick you up and going to take you away, and then you're going to end up in a residential school. That was passed on from her parents to her, which was passed on. So the intergenerational is survival skills passed from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. Does that kind of make sense? Yes. Yes. So I do believe in hypnosis, for example, but what I believe in hypnosis is it's done by a highly trained person, and the hypnosis is somebody that understands trauma narratives too. My partner in private practice, I think Valdez met her, she's a certified hypnotist, right? She would do some of that work. I certainly wouldn't do it, because I'm not trained in it, right? But I do believe that there's a place for it, absolutely.
Yeah, I have a simple question. Do you think that the spiritual aspect has an impact when you deal with trauma? The impact. For example, for the people from the countries, they experience war, for example.
Yeah.
It's very hard for them to even express what happened during their lives.
Yeah.
But we just see what is happening around in their lives and their children and something like that.
Yeah.
So it's very complex, very hard for those people who do not believe other thing, but they only believe in the spiritual aspect.
Yeah.
Is the spiritual play a bigger role in terms of managing traumatic?
Right. So for me, around the spiritual stuff, it's really around what has meaning for that person, and how do I support that person use their own beliefs in what they're experiencing today. You know, because the spirituality stuff is the loss of hope for me, loss of a belief system, those types of things. You know, I'm not really sure what you're touching on here, but I believe that, you know, going to what helps the person is really important. I work in a, you know, I've also worked with survivors of sexual abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church, right? And so there's just a huge loss of spirituality and trust there, right? You know, and they couldn't talk about it for years and things like that, right? So I understand that many people have been affected by religions from a position of power, and you need to help them work through that so they can kind of gain some sense of control of their life today. But also people need hope too, and that's kind of how I phrase spirituality and what has meaning for you to help you as you're kind of going through your day-to-day stuff. Sometimes it can be churches, sometimes it can be support groups, sometimes it can be family members. Whatever gives that person meaning and purpose in life is where I go to. Is that? It's included, yes, absolutely. Yeah. All people need hope, right? We all need hope.
I have a question about children. So some children, when they come from other countries, it's very usual in their countries to hit each other or to push each other in the schools. And sometimes we were called to the schools because this child who came from a war zone, he has a trauma. And sometimes I think it's not a trauma, it's a behavioral issue with the child that has to be addressed. So how can we differentiate between a trauma and a behavioral issue with children, especially in schools? Thank you.
It's a great question. I think like when we first started this work within our organization, all of the counselors and stuff used to come forward and kind of go, but he's got a trauma history. As if that's kind of like a, what I call a get out of jail free card, as if that gives you right to do anything that you want. Because you have a trauma history doesn't mean that you're not responsible for your behaviors. And we need to be able, when things happen, we need to be able to sit and work with that person to help them find out what other things they might have been able to do in that situation when they went to their trauma place. That's a simple answer to a long work process with that child and stuff, but just acknowledging or recognizing that the child has gone to the trauma place. That's where they're acting from. How do you work with that child so that you acknowledge that, but also say, you know, maybe that's not the best way to deal with it because it's just going to get you into more trouble. You might want to deal with it differently. That's kind of the work that we do. Yeah. These are very complex questions, and I'm trying to give you like 30-second answers.
I don't have a question, actually. Just maybe a comment that sometimes what the agencies do, I mean, put the clients in that to recall some kind of their traumas. Like, for example, a couple of years ago, a community group decided to take the Syrian children to attend, for example, New Year's fireworks. Yes. But apparently the kids start to not only cry, but start to act hysterically because they recall what had happened there. Yes. A couple of weeks ago, there is a practice in our organization that just to, we call it black out the curtains, so in case of intruder comes. So one of the teachers called me just to interpret for a newcomer what this practice is. So I saw that he started to be uncomfortable. He said, well, you are just blocking the curtains from the intruders. What do you think, if, for example, about myself? I escaped my house with the kids barefoot because the ISIS has invaded our house. So sometimes some of these practices that we feel, okay, we just want to make you safe, but for him, he didn't feel safe even here. Right. If there's something can happen here, so where we can go?
Absolutely. Like what we do, I think it's all education because, you know, I think that once we acknowledge that people have got trauma experiences, and if they've gone through PTSD or PTS, you may not know the minute detail of a story, but you know that they have a trauma experience because this is what it is. Like what we would do at that point, or if it wasn't our organization, we would really advocate for the client, kind of going, you're re-traumatizing this person. You're actually putting him back into the place that kind of created all of this fear and all of this stuff, right? Why would we want to do that for a child? It's because service providers don't get it. They don't know what to do, right? So remember when I kind of said at the start, what we see as very normal behaviors are just totally overwhelming for the trauma survivor, right? That's what happened in that case, right? So we need to support them, I believe, and just kind of go, no, we can't be doing that because that's just going to re-traumatize him. Yeah. I think that's our job. Other thoughts? I know we're kind of, sorry, I screwed up their schedule. One more question. No, I think we're done. Great. Well, I want to thank everybody. I really love coming out and talking to people. This is my passion. You guys are doing incredible, incredible work. And just because I come here today and say, do not get into trauma-specific services, does not diminish the work that you guys are doing. What your clients need to know, what your clients need to experience is safety, and to feel safe and feel support, to feel love, to feel caring. That's what they need. The work you're doing is incredible. So you guys should give yourself a hand of applause. Thank you.
Thank you to John. John, this was an awesome presentation. Do you guys agree it was awesome? Okay. One of the things I was talking to Joy was one of the comments that John made. Should settlement organizations become trauma-informed organizations? That would be a bigger question for us to take back. Let's process this. What does it mean for our organizations to be trauma-informed? If we want to, if we are experiencing today what we learned that even healthy immigrants go through some kind of an adaptation, kind of a shock, through a variety of experiences. If that's what it is, and then we are getting, because of the geopolitical situation in the world, we are getting displaced individuals to Canada, making our life a little bit more difficult for us to kind of go through the process, helping them the process of settlement and integration. That would be a question for us to kind of have some discussion at a later date, maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow we have set aside a chunk of our time to have some interactive discussions on tables. And that was precisely for this reason. How do we up our clinical skills to be able to just make an assessment, and then because we are not clinicians as skilled as John is, we may be able to recognize, provide a little bit of safety, and then we say, okay guys, we're gonna warm referral you to a specialist that is dealing with it. Thank you, John. Thank you. It was an awesome. Thank you. We are going to go for a break, and then we are coming back at